This is a story about a message. It's a message the Chicago outfit thought was loud, clear, and absolutely terrifying. But what they couldn't have possibly known is that the message they left in the trunk of a car would end up being their own undoing.
Now, that right there, that's not from some crime novel. That is an official line from a medical examiner's report back in 1961. It's a professional, almost clinical statement that just screams absolute horror. And that one sentence, well, it sets the stage for one of the most brutal and, believe it or not, consequential murders in the history of the Mafia.
Okay, so picture this. The story doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts with a smell. You're at O'Hare Airport, this bustling symbol of modern Chicago, and there's this old beat-up car. When the police finally pop that trunk, they don't just find a body, they find a statement.
So who was this man in the trunk? His name was William Action Jackson, and in life, that nickname fit him perfectly. He was, for all intents and purposes, a tool for the Chicago outfit, a human hammer, and a very, very effective one.
But here's the thing about this guy. There was this incredible contrast. On the street, Action Jackson was this terrifying figure. We're talking 6'2", 300 pounds of pure muscle. But the guys who knew him, they knew the reality. He had this childlike simplicity. I mean, they said he was dumb as a box of rocks, and that made him the perfect instrument for the mob. All brute force, no questions asked. He was literally their human hammer.
Every story like this has a turning point, right? And for Jackson, it was that moment where the hammer gets used and then just left on the ground, abandoned. This is how the outfit's most reliable enforcer became their single greatest liability.
It all started when Jackson got picked up in a federal raid. You know, when they asked him why he didn't run like everybody else, he just said, "I'm too fat." He knew what he was. But then, the outfit, they just cut him loose. No lawyers, no bail money, nothing. He was abandoned. And that, right there, that made him the perfect target for an FBI agent named William Romer, who saw a huge opening. Jackson was completely cornered, and really, his only way out was to start talking.
And his response to the FBI? It wasn't some long negotiation. There were no complex demands. Just that simple question, what do I gotta do? For a guy who'd spent his whole life taking orders, this was just a new set of instructions from a new boss. And just like that, he became an FBI source.
But here's the thing. In the world of the outfit, there's a code of silence. It's called omerta, and breaking that code, well, it carries a heavy price. Jackson was about to find out that the outfit always pays its debts, especially debts of betrayal, in the most brutal way you can imagine.
So how'd they find out he was talking? It wasn't some sophisticated spy game. Nope, it was just the reality of 1960s Chicago. Corruption. The outfit had eyes and ears everywhere, especially inside the police department. A patrolman sees Jackson's car parked near an FBI building. A detective spots him with an agent. A phone call gets made. It was really that simple, and that deadly.
The trap was set with this chilling efficiency. He gets a call from someone he trusted, a promise of a big score, just another day at the office for a guy like Jackson. He was lured to a meat rendering plant, a place where all the noise and, well, the smell could easily cover up anything that was about to happen.
What they did to him next wasn't just a murder, it was a carefully crafted message. Every single act of torture was symbolic. They shattered his kneecaps, right, so he could never stand in a courtroom to testify. They even drilled a hole through his ear, a gruesome, specific punishment for the sin of listening to the feds. This wasn't chaos. This was a script written in violence.
And maybe the most horrifying detail of all this, the duration. They kept him alive for 2 full days. 48 hours. And a really tragic twist, the same immense physical power that made him such a good enforcer is what ended up prolonging his agony. His body just wouldn't give up.
Now, the outfit, they thought their message was delivered when they shut that trunk. They were wrong. In their attempt to enforce silence with absolute terror, they kicked off a chain reaction that they never, ever could have seen coming.
This one murder set off this incredible ripple effect. First, you've got Agent Romer. He feels so guilty, he becomes obsessed. And he launches this personal, psychological war against the outfit boss Sam Giancana. Then you've got Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who takes the gruesome crime scene photos and uses them to show the whole country the real face of the Mafia. And maybe most critically, those exact same photos helped convince another mobster, Joseph Valachi, that his only shot at survival was to testify.
I mean, you can literally draw a straight line from one event to the next.
Jackson's murder in '61 directly leads to the pressure that causes Joseph Valachi to testify in '63. That testimony completely shattered the myth that the Mafia was untouchable. And just a couple years after that, the relentless FBI pressure that Agent Romer started forced Sam Giancana, the head of the whole Chicago outfit, to flee the country.
And that brings us to the final and most stunning irony of this entire story. The outfit tried so hard to make William Jackson a symbol of their terrifying power, but in death, he became something else entirely.
Just look at the difference between what they wanted and what they got. They thought extreme fear would guarantee silence. Instead, that brutality inspired the most important testimony ever. They wanted to show that betrayal gets punished. Instead, Jackson's murder became the FBI's #1 recruiting tool. They thought they were proving they were in control, when in reality, they were writing the first chapter of their own downfall.
And here's the kicker. None of the men who actually did this to him ever faced a murder charge for it. The consequences weren't served in a courtroom for them. They were systemic, shaking the entire foundation of the very organization they were trying to protect. The FBI flipped the script completely. Agents would literally walk into a room with a mobster they wanted to flip, they'd lay out the crime scene photos of Jackson, and they'd make the choice painfully clear. You can work with us, or you can risk ending up like this. The very thing meant to keep them quiet became the single best reason to talk. So when you think about it, he was this simple man, used his whole life as a blunt instrument. And in the end, his horrific death transformed him into a sharp-edged weapon that cut right to the heart of the Chicago outfit. What an incredible, unintended legacy. Ultimately, this whole story just leaves you with this fascinating question about power. The outfit was so sure they understood the language of violence. But what happens when your audience reads your message in a way you never, ever intended? What happens when your loudest warning actually becomes a rallying cry for your enemy?